Dr. Fishman is professor of Jewish history at JTS. He teaches courses in modern Jewish history, and he also serves as director of Project Judaica, which is our program in the FSU. And his most recent book, which I imagine a lot of you have read, is The Book Smugglers, Partisans, Poets, and the Race to Save Jewish Treasures from the Nazis, which he'll, of course, draw from in today's session. And the book was the recipient of the Jewish Book Council's 2017 National Jewish Book Award and has received quite a lot of praise. Just a couple of quick announcements. So I mentioned last week, we're so excited to be launching a new series for the spring semester that is going to start on January 4th. It's called The Other in Jewish Text and Tradition. We have an amazing faculty lineup for you. And the most important announcement I want to make at the moment, you'll get this by email also, but the session, we're moving the time. It's going to be 2 to 3:30 Eastern. Instead of 1 to 2:30, it's going to be 2 o'clock Eastern, same length of time, hour and a half, so 2 p.m. Eastern. So mark your calendars. We'll be starting January 4th and really going pretty much through the whole spring semester. And the second and last announcement I wanted to make for today is that if you are feeling inspired by this opportunity to engage in Jewish learning with JTS's outstanding scholars, we would like you to partner. We'd like to invite you to partner with us in sponsoring a learning session. We have 2 sponsorship levels. Here's what we came up with: Chacham for $540 and Tzaddik for $1,000. So if you'd like to inquire about sponsorship, please email learninglives@jtsa.edu, learninglives@jtsa.edu, or you can call 212-678-8866. And with that, I will turn it over to Tani to walk us through the plans for the rest of today's session.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. So just to quickly go over the Q&A for today's session, Dr. Fishman will pause for questions once during the session, and again at the end. You can use the chat feature to submit your questions to Rabbi Julia Andelman. To open the chat, hover your cursor over the bottom of the Zoom screen and click on the chat icon. During the Q&A period, Julia will select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Fishman. Please note that you will only be able to chat with JTS staff. You will not be able to send messages to the group or to Dr. Fishman. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or Lynn Feynman. For those of you who have called in only, you will not be able to ask a question. Please consider joining via Zoom for our future sessions. And I'm going to go ahead now and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Fishman. So just give me 1 second.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody, or good evening, good morning, wherever you may be. Thank you to Rabbi Julia Andelman and to Tani Schwartz-Herman for inviting me and organizing this. What I've seen has been a really extraordinary series this semester. As Julia mentioned, the talk I'm going to give, well, it may be different than other ones you've heard because it's a historical talk. It's a narrative. It's a real-to-life story, which I researched and then wrote up as a book. Even though it's set in and against the Holocaust and its aftermath, it's fundamentally an inspiring story about people who, under terrible conditions, were able to pursue a life of meaning, and they found that meaning in the rescue of Jewish culture, Jewish literature, Jewish heritage from the hands of the Nazis. And I'm going to present to you, as I've been actually presenting to my students this past semester, using a great deal of slides, images, to make it vivid. I will come back from time to time just so you remember what I look like. And I will stop in the middle of this story so you can submit questions. here we go. I hope you can see it. This is the book. I'm only showing off one thing, that it just appeared in Hebrew translation in Israel as well, and it's also appeared in other languages. This remarkable story takes place in a city called Vilna. As you can see from this map, before World War II, Vilna was part of Poland. Today, the city is called Vilnius, and it's the capital of independent Lithuania. But before the war, it belonged to Poland. Wherever it belonged, because for a time it belonged to Russia, Jews called it Lita, Lithuania, and called Vilna Jerusalem de Lita, the Jerusalem of Lithuania, which is a very powerful image, and not every community in Jewish history gets referred to as a Jerusalem. When we have such communities throughout Jewish history, they're always special in some kind of intellectual and spiritual way. Of course, Vilna is famous for its rabbis, and most of all for this rabbi, the Vilna Gaon, Rabbi Elijah of Vilna, a great scholar, person who devoted his life only to learning the holy books. And he is, in a sense, the founder of the Vilna tradition of intellectualism, of study, and of book culture as being at the heart of Jewish life. So Vilna becomes a great center of Jewish printing. The classical edition of the Talmud was called the Vilna Shas, the Vilna Talmud, which appeared several times in the 19th century. The Vilna Talmud, Vilna provided the basic religious literature for all of East European Jewry, and to some extent to all of European Jewry, that is the Sidurim, the Machzorim, the Haggadahs, the Chumashim, and the Talmuds. And then in the 20th century, when Jews become more secular, more modern, Vilna becomes a great center of Yiddish publishing, which you see on the right-hand side. At its peak, this community, which only had on the eve of World War II, or on the eve of the Nazi invasion, 70,000 Jews. It's not a very large community. This community, it was the fourth largest Jewish community in Poland before the war, after Warsaw, Lodz, and Lvov. It is the fourth largest Jewish community in Poland, but in terms of publishing, in terms of book culture, it by far outpaces Lvov and even outpaces Lodz. On the eve of the war, there were 5 Yiddish daily newspapers in this relatively small community. And this is a scene, a picture actually, a drawing of the Jewish Community Library in Vilna from the outside, the Strashun Library, which was built literally as an annex, as a kind of attachment to the Great Synagogue, what was known as the Stadtschule. So the Great Synagogue went back to the 1500s. This building, the library building, was built in 1900. This is the interior of the Great Strashun Library, which had 5 Hebrew incunabula. That's books in Hebrew printed before the year 1500. All incunabula are rare in any language, but there weren't very many Hebrew incunabula, that is, books printed usually in Spain or in Italy. But the Strashun Library had 5 such books, and it had many hundreds of books from the 1500s. And this is a great community center. The Strashun Library was actually open, believe it or not, 7 days a week, including Shabbat afternoon. You couldn't take notes. You couldn't order books, but if you'd ordered before Shabbat, you could come in Shabbat afternoon and read in the Strashun Library. It is, let me just say in sum, the greatest library in Europe under Jewish auspices before the Holocaust. And this is another great collection, which is the YIVO Institute, the Yiddish Scientific Institute in Vilna. It had also a very important Yiddish library, but most important, it had a great Jewish archive. It had all kinds of documents, manuscripts, records of community organizations, of synagogues, records of social service organizations, even posters and placards. All of this was held in this in the archive of this Yiddish Scientific Institute in Vilna. And there are many other great Jewish collections in this city, which I call in the book the city of the book. There is a Jewish museum, there are yeshivas, there are the teacher seminaries for Hebrew language schools and Yiddish language schools were situated in Vilna, not in Warsaw, but in Vilna. There are synagogues, there are the collections, private collections of rare books by scholars, writers, and rabbis. And last but not least, to round out this picture, Vilna had not only collected books and studied books, it had intellectuals who wrote books and produced great works of literature. So this is a literary group, the literary group known as Young Vilna, poets, story novelists, even a couple of plastic artists and sculptors thrown in to the group as well. And the two figures that will matter a lot for what the story I'm going to tell you are these two poets. The one in the center is hard name to pronounce, Shmerke Kaczerginski, and next to him, his friend Avrom Sutzkever. Kaczerginski is an amazing life story. He was an orphan. Both his parents died in World War I. He was raised in an orphanage, and yet he pulls himself up by his bootstraps from an orphanage to become a major Yiddish writer. And he is a man of the left. He's actually became a member of the underground Communist Party before World War II in Poland. His friend, Sutzkever, totally apolitical. Sutzkever said, the only ideology I believe in is poetry. He's the grandson of a rabbi. He's a nature poet, a real aesthete. But the two of them, despite their different poetic orientations, their different political or apolitical orientations, are the best of friends in the group. The third member I'll point out, because some of you may have heard of him, is this man in the far left, which is the Yiddish writer Chaim Grade, poet and novelist, also a member of Young Vilna. Now I'm going to go to the body of the story, because this story takes place, at least its major part, during the Nazi occupation of Vilna. The Germans came to Vilna late. The Germans came to Vilna only with the campaign against the Soviet Union in June of 1941. They didn't, like in Warsaw, arrive in the fall of 1939. They arrived only much later, almost 2 years later. They came late, but they worked very quickly and very efficiently. There were roundups of Jews already in the summer of 1941. The Vilna Ghetto was established in September of 1941. And the ghetto, at its founding, had 40,000 inhabitants. That is, the Jewish population of Vilna had already by that point gone down from 70,000 to 40,000. And in the next 4 months, till the end of 1941, it will be cut in half again to 20,000. The Jews of Vilna in those terrible 6 months from July till December 1941 were rounded up and sent to the outskirts of the city to a mass murder site that Jews called Ponar, in Polish Ponari, in Lithuania Panerai, but I'll call it Ponar, which is just a ravine in the middle of the forest where they were mowed down by machine gun, what we now refer to as the Holocaust by bullets. This is before there was an Auschwitz or other death camps. And then quite remarkably and surprisingly, after this terrible bloodletting of 6 months, the mass murder stopped in January 1942. There'll still be terrible atrocities, but on a much, much smaller scale for the next year and a half, which will be known as the period of stability of the Vilna Ghetto. The 20,000 that are left are now locked up in the ghetto as slave laborers. And it's a rather dreary existence of every day leaving the ghetto in a work brigade in the morning and then working for nothing or for a pittance, and then coming home at the end of the day back into the ghetto. And of course, most ghetto inmates are concerned about food and about food rations, and many of them are smuggling food through the ghetto gate, or at least trying to smuggle food through this ghetto gate. There are different types of guards. What's most dangerous, of course, is when there are Germans at the gate. People can be sent to their deaths for trying to smuggle food into the ghetto if they're discovered by Germans at the gate. Now to the core of our story itself. And I need to introduce you to this Nazi German organization, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the Rosenberg detail. Alfred Rosenberg was one of Hitler's closest lieutenants, and he created this special detail, which its goal was to loot cultural treasures all across Europe. The master race should have the greatest library, the greatest museum. They are the master race, so everything should belong to them. And they looted museums and libraries, again, everywhere where the Germans conquered, from Paris to Amsterdam to Warsaw and Kiev, and also Vilna. What's less known about them, about this organization, which is well known and is mentioned in the movie Monuments Men, what's less known is that they had a department, the ERR, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, to loot Judaica, to loot books, art, other rare items related to the Jews, their history, their religion, their culture. Yes, it's paradoxical. At the same time that the Germans are murdering Jews in enormous numbers, they are collecting or looting Jewish books. They're doing this, they're collecting these books for what is known as Judenforschung. Judenforschung was a branch of Nazi scholarship or science, anti-Semitic Jewish studies. That is, Nazi scholars who will, through their scholarship, prove how depraved the Jews are, how evil the Jews are, and this quote-unquote science will justify the persecution and eventually extermination of the Jews. And this is Johannes Paul, who is the top Judaica expert for the ERR. He knows Hebrew. He studied actually in Jerusalem for several years. before the rise of the Nazis. He knows Yiddish, he knows Bible, he knows Talmud. He knows enough to appreciate that Vilna is a very special place, that it has these great Jewish book collections. It's one of his top priorities. In the whole map of Europe, when it comes to looting Judaica, Paul understands that Vilna is very important. And therefore, Paul and others with him come to Vilna literally 10 days after the Germans conquer the city. In the very beginning of July, of 1941, he is there getting a lay of the land, the Strashun Library, the Yiddish Institute, YIVO, the other collections, and he is stunned. He is stunned that there are so many books and there are so many treasures and there are so many important items. He's actually initially at a loss what to do, because he can't send everything to Germany for Judenforschung. There's just too much. And by the way, with so many libraries, he doesn't need 5 or 6 copies of the same book to be sent from Vilna to Germany. He needs 1 copy or maybe 2 copies. And he comes up with the only plausible plan, which is he'll have to have people to sort the material, to sort it between what should be sent to Germany and what is not needed for Judenforschung, what is duplicates and other such things. And everything that's not needed will be destroyed as trash. Now, who will do this sorting, what might even call it selection, between what will go to Germany and what will be destroyed? At that time, the only solution was to create a brigade of Jewish slave laborers, Jewish intellectuals who will sort what will remain alive because it will be sent to Germany and what will be destroyed and sent either simply to be burnt or to be recycled, repulped into new paper, recycled. So Paul creates this brigade of Jewish slave laborers. Here you can see a book with the a Hebrew book with the Nazi swastika at the bottom, sent to the Institute for the Investigation of the Jewish Question in Frankfurt. This brigade of Jewish intellectuals, slave laborers, gets the name the Paper Brigade. That's a nickname it acquired. And they're all ghetto inmates who in one way or another were intellectuals before the war. They're either like Hermann Kruk here, the head of the brigade, was a professional librarian. Others, as you'll see, were scholars, writers, musicians, artists, a lot of teachers and educators of different kind. The brigade consisted of 20 intellectual workers, as they were called, and 20 technical workers. Technical workers are people that lug boxes and crates, make the boxes and crates, move the things to the shipping station or to either Germany or to be destroyed. People who maintain the building, you need even a cook. So there are 20 technical workers, and then there are the 20 sorters. This is Elad Kalmanovich, who was in this brigade, a scholar from the Yiddish Institute. I should mention the head of the brigade, Kruk, was a socialist, a Bundist, the main Jewish Socialist Party. Kalmanovich, on the other hand, is at this point, a Zionist, a religious believer. And yet then 2 of them are thrust into working together and actually work well together in this situation. And here are the 2 poets I mentioned to you before, the same 2 poets we saw in Jung Vilna, Shmerke Kaczerginski on the left and Avrom Sutzkever on the right who also work for this brigade. And finally, again, the two poets, but in between them, their friend Rochel or Rachela Pupko-Krinsky. She, Rochel Krinsky, was a high school teacher of history at one of the best Jewish high schools in Vilna. She had a master's degree from Vilna University in history. She knew Latin and Old Polish. She has a very special personal history because her husband was murdered by the Germans immediately when they came in, literally in the first week or two of the German occupation. When the ghetto was created, which is a few months later in September 1941, she had a 18-month daughter, and she decided she was not going to take her daughter into the ghetto. She went into the ghetto alone. She left her daughter with her Polish nanny, and the Polish nanny moved to another part of town and presented this toddler as if it were her own daughter, a Polish girl, and the nanny raised the daughter for the entire wartime period. So she enters the ghetto Rochel alone. All she's got are her friends, such as the poets, and well, the other thing she has is her love of books. She will read, she will recite poetry from heart, and that's, she says, one of the things that kept her going. Now, this is for them excruciating work because what the Germans are forcing them to do is to be complicit, to collaborate in the destruction and plunder of Jewish cultural heritage, of Jewish books, whether they be religious books or they be secular books. They're all readers, they're all book lovers, and this is for them torture, that they will participate in this enterprise. And they can't live with themselves actually doing that. And they come up with a plan that there must be a third way. It can't be, there must be a way to rescue material so that the Germans don't get it or destroy it. And that will be, of course, hiding it. Before I go into that, there's one type of material the Germans don't send to Germany and don't destroy, and that is Torah scrolls. Torah scrolls are made out of parchment, which is not paper, but of course animal hide. And the Germans from Vilna, where there are more than 100 synagogues and many hundreds of scrolls, the Germans cut up the Torah scrolls to use them as inserts to repair German army boots. This is just one example of a part of a Sefer Torah where in the shape of a shoe to repair an army boot. And maybe everything is contained in this picture. In other words, the utter desecration of Jewish tradition and heritage and culture, and also the sense of burning anger that the people in this group had, but could not show. The only way they could show their burning anger was by an operation to rescue material. How do you rescue the material? The main way they rescue material is literally under their clothing. That is, there are moments, there are actually many moments when the Germans are not there at the work site. Their work site is outside the ghetto. Germans leave it for lunch and for other activities. And during that time, they can prepare a little pile of what they will hide, little books or others. In the winter, it's easier, under your coat, under your boots, under your pants, and take it to the one place where you know Jews will take care of it, which is into the ghetto. Take these books and papers back into the ghetto where they can be hidden, where they can be buried. That, of course, is very, very risky because, again, if you're caught with books at the gate to the ghetto, you could be sent to your death. Even though books were not treated as severely as food, still it was a very serious offense. And that is the moment of truth. When they get to the gate and when they're inspected, and there are many stories of just really lucky moments where they were got by the skin of their teeth. I'll mention just one. Rachel Krinsky, the historian, the high school teacher, she put in under her coat a Kiddush cup, a silver Kiddush cup, which was discovered by a German at the gate. Everyone assumed Rachel Krinsky is about to be sent to her death. She didn't lose her cool. She turned around to the German official and said, "Oh, this silver goblet, I brought it for you. It's a present. Please take it. And I have a very nice pair of gloves for you as well." Basically, it was a bribe. The German took the bribe. He was in a good mood, I guess, that day, and let her through. So these are many stories of just luck that enabled them to pass through. I'm going to speak for about 5 more minutes, and then I'm going to take questions. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten to take a break for questions. Once the material is in the ghetto, there were bunkers and all kinds of hiding places where the material was literally buried. This is a diagram of the main bunker in the Vilna Ghetto, which you entered from a manhole, right, from a sewage system, and you went deeper below. And this bunker was actually used for 2 purposes. It was originally built to store arms because there's an armed underground in the Vilna Ghetto. People who are planning to have a great Vilna Ghetto uprising. They've got guns they've acquired and they're stored there. But right next to the guns are the books and the papers and the documents that this paper brigade brought inside. And so in a sense, the 2 forms of resistance to the Germans are right next to each other in this bunker. Now, maybe this is the moment, I'll say this and then I'll pause. You know, this was in a sense a controversial act what these people were doing. There were actually ghetto inmates who said, "You're crazy. This is the ghetto. People don't have enough food. You should be smuggling in potatoes. You should be smuggling in food. Think about your families. Think about the community here. Why are you wasting your time hiding books and papers underneath your clothing?" But this group was very committed to this, and for several reasons. First of all, this was a kind of existential choice. In other words, we're all imperiled and we may all very soon be killed for whatever reason. If I'm going to be killed, I'd rather be killed because I tried to rescue a rare book, a rare cultural treasure, than to be killed because I tried to smuggle a potato. I want to connect my life, what's left of my life, and it may be very short, and my death to something that matters, to something that's meaningful. And therefore, I'm going to smuggle in books and other cultural treasures. The other motivations were a belief that there would be a Jewish people after the war. And I'm putting it that way because that wasn't at all clear that there would, to them in the ghetto, that there ever would be anything left of the Jewish people after the war, after what they'd gone through. But they believed there would be a Jewish people after the ghetto, after the war. And the Jewish people will need to have its cultural treasures, its rare books, its manuscripts and documents. So they're doing this for the future. They're doing this not for themselves. Again, they didn't expect to survive themselves. They're doing this for the next generation of Jews, wherever they will be after the war. And finally, I'll mention one other motivation and then need to stop for questions. They love their community. They love Vilna, which for them, Vilna and books were the same thing. And they realized this community is doomed. This community will never be again. But if we rescue the books, the documents, the manuscripts, we have rescued the essence of what Vilna is about for posterity. So I think this is a good moment for me to pause and take questions that have come up through the chat. And then, of course, I will continue.
Thank you, Professor Fishman. Lots of questions and also just a lot of expressions of gratitude for how you've put together and are sharing this material. So let me start with the most general question because a lot of people have asked it. People are curious how you did this research. How did these stories survive? One person asked specifically, do we know what happened in the ghetto, the things that Smugglers didn't want to share? How did you put all this to find it and put it all together?
That's my favorite question because it was a tremendous amount of work. Unfortunately, by the time I started writing this book, very few people from this group were those who survived, where many of them did not survive. But from those who survived, very few were alive in the early, in the 2010s. There were a couple, but I was mainly relying on other sources. Several people from this group wrote diaries in the ghetto. And even if they did not survive, their diaries survived. And I could use ghetto diaries from all kinds of people. Those who survived all wrote memoirs about it in Yiddish. This material was mainly in Hebrew and Yiddish. So I had the memoirs of those who went through this and survived. Quite, well, I don't know, the most difficult material is, of course, the Germans were meticulous at documenting everything, including this. And so the records of the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the German records of exactly what they were doing and how they were doing it, have survived. I found letters between the heroes who survived, writing to each other after World War II. As you'll see, the poets Sutzker and Kaczerginski survived. So there was a lot of piecing together. I think I went through the whole literature on the Vilna Ghetto, and it was very much piecing together from many, many different sources.
Thank you. I think people asked if the incunabula survived.
No, the incunabula have never been found. The 5 Hebrew books from before 1500 disappeared early. Suspicion is that some German took them, maybe Paul himself, not for the Institute for the Investigation of the Jewish Question, but maybe for themselves in order to sell it on some kind of market, because they have never been found. I can't imagine the Germans sent them to be destroyed, or that the paper brigade suggested destroying that. So that is a kind of mystery. What happened to the 5 incunabula?
We have a handful of questions about the paper brigade, so I'll put those together. So one is, how did people get on that group? Was there an opportunity to volunteer, or were you just, chosen, assigned based on what they already knew about your profession? There was also, there was a question, was there controversy among members of the group about, priority of what should be saved or rescued? And then a question, I don't know about this, I'm sure that you do. Did they know of the Warsaw Orning Shabbos group?
Okay. How the group was put together, the Germans knew that Kruk, the head of the group, was a librarian, and they simply walked into him one day in the ghetto and said to him, "You're heading this group, and you pick people to do this job with you." So basically, Kruk appointed the whole rest of the intellectual brigade, and he knew he needed a variety of languages and backgrounds and skills. No one could volunteer for this work. In fact, there were people who refused to do this work because, as they describe it, they're crying. How do you watch a bulldozer, a tractor come and simply, dispose of Bibles and Talmuds and other books as trash without crying? So there were people who refused to do this job because they said, I can't take that emotionally. I'd rather work at the train station or, in some kind of factory, something emotionally neutral. As far as what to rescue, a lot depended on literally the moment. Everybody makes their own decisions. There can't be coordinated decisions. Everybody's working in a different room, getting different material. And they literally have to make spur of the moment decisions. Obviously, if they saw the same book twice or 3 times, the second and third copy, they're going to send off to be destroyed and hold on to one copy. But it is important to say there were no ideological or political motivations in what to rescue. I mentioned the poet Kaczerginski, Shmerka Kaczerginski, was a communist before the war. He rescues his life for Hebrew religious books. He's got these all kinds of religious books literally around his torso and under his underwear. And he's risking his life. He's a communist and he's risking his life because he understood that, first of all Jews are in danger and all of Jewish heritage, whether it's secular or religious, is the same in the eyes of the Nazis, and all of it needs to be rescued. Did they know about what was happening in Warsaw, the Orning Shabbos? They had a little bit of information. There was some underground correspondence between Vilna and Warsaw. And in some ways, the operations were similar. So I think I'll leave it at that, but there's not real cooperation. There couldn't be. They're both in these hermetically sealed ghettos where the hardest thing is just getting a letter from one city to another.
So maybe let's do one more question, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
There are 3 questions about women. Both that first image that you shared with us of the library, were women allowed there? Did they play any role there? And another question just came in. Actually, sorry, the same question. And then just a parallel to that, someone asked also about Hasidim, and were they in this picture at all, or was it just the Minatim, the Vilna Ghetto school?
Well, the interesting question is about the community library, the Strashun library. Of course, YIVO, the Yiddish Institute, was a modern secular institution, and of course, women were, active in YIVO in all spheres. One of the, young graduate students and staff members at YIVO then was, right before the war, was Lucy Davidowitz. But the more interesting question is the Strashun library, the community library right next to the synagogue. And the answer is yes, women were in the reading room. They weren't on the staff, it was a small library, but women were in the reading room. The one place where all types of Jews in Vilna met was in the library. In other words, whether they were Orthodox or secular, whether they were Zionist or Bundist, they all met there. And yes, so there were rabbis complaining that there are women in the reading room whose sleeves are too short. But there were no rules and, no restrictions. And women were part of the reading community in the Strashun library, just like men. Hasidim, on the other hand, is another story. Vilna was historically, of course, the Vilna Gaon had banned Hasidism, put them in cherem, excommunicated them, and that had a legacy. In other words, Vilna there were very few Hasidim in Vilna. There were some, but not many, very few. They tended to be Lubavitch, Chabad, Hasidim. So, and again, they're not numerous. So Hasidim did not play a prominent role in the communal life of Vilna.
You want to go ahead with your teaching?
Yes, I think I'm going to go ahead. And let me add something to give you a sense of scope. Numbers, and I'll go back to this slide. This operation of rescuing these books and papers went on for a year and a half. This year and a half of the period of stability of the Vilna Ghetto, from February 1942 till August 1943. In other words, they're doing this just about daily for a year and a half. And you can do the math. Let's say each person hides 3 items, and that you've got 20 people rescuing material, and they do that for 500 days. I'm just simplifying the math, right? That comes to 30,000 items, right? 500 times 3 times 20. So you can, in this process, rescue a lot of books and materials. And there are other ways they rescued material. I'll get to that in a minute. I just wanted to point out, Sutzkever, the poet, writes a poem about this experience in the ghetto, right? And I'll read a few stanzas and then explain, right? As if protecting a baby, I run bearing Jewish words. I grope in every courtyard. The spirit won't be murdered by the hordes. And I dig and plant manuscripts. And if by despair I am beat, my mind recalls Egypt, a tale about grains of wheat. Now let me explain this tale about grains of wheat. It's a story of an Egyptian pharaoh who ordered that when he dies, he be put in this sarcophagus and buried, but alongside him, there should be grains of wheat. And that was done, some kind of pyramid, and there's the pharaoh and the grains of wheat. Thousands of years later, this sarcophagus was opened, the grains of wheat are discovered, and that's what he says, right? 9,000 years have passed, but when the grains were sown, they blossomed in sunny stalks, row after row full grown. Perhaps these words will endure and live to see the light loom, and in the destined hour will unexpectedly bloom. And like the primeval grain that turned into a stalk, the words will nourish, the words will belong to the people in its eternal walk. In other words, I am not burying this material, I am planting it. And like grains of wheat, I have this hope or this faith that someday it will be discovered, it will blossom. In other words, these words will nourish and belong to the Jewish people in its eternal walk. So that's the act of faith that's really contained in this activity. You can feel both the despair and the hope in this poem. Another way that materials were rescued was with non-Jewish friends. As I mentioned briefly, the Germans left the work site unattended during the lunch hour. They went out to lunch, the Germans. They weren't worried that anybody from the working brigade would escape, because first of all, if anybody escapes, they'll simply murder the whole brigade. So collective punishment. So nobody's going to do that. And by the way, this is Nazi-occupied Poland. It's not, where are you going to go and who is going to hide you and who is going to harbor you? So actually the group, no one ever even tried to escape. But the lunch hour was the opportunity for non-Jewish friends to visit this work brigade. And yes, to give them a little food, to share some news, some encouragement, and take away materials, especially larger materials that you couldn't hide underneath your clothing. These non-Jewish friends would take away and keep in their homes or in other hiding places. As long as they left during the lunch hour before the Germans came back, which they were careful to do. This is Ona Shemaitya. She was a professional librarian at the Vilna University Library. She knew some of these people from before the war, from the university library. She's an ethnic Lithuanian who hid a lot of material. Both, she did even more than that in her home and in other places. She even went in to visit the Vilna Ghetto and to visit these people in the ghetto. How did she do that? It's quite extraordinary because non-Jews were not allowed to enter the ghetto. It was sealed off. But she went to the guards and said, I'm librarian at the university library. And there are people in this ghetto, inmates, who have overdue library books. They borrowed these books before the ghetto was founded. They took it into the ghetto. I've got to retrieve our library books. And they would let her in. The guards let her in. And she'd meet people. She even served as a kind of courier of correspondence. In other words, other non-Jews wrote letters to ghetto inmates who then wrote letters to their non-Jewish friends, and she was the courier. Often when she left, she left with books and papers under her arm. These are materials that the paper brigade smuggled into the ghetto that she now took out as her ostensible overdue library books. The last time she visited the Vilna Ghetto, it was actually September 1943, a rainy day. Under her coat, she hid not books, but a little Jewish girl. And she hid that girl in her home. That girl survived and eventually left after the war to Israel. And Ona Shemaitya was one of the first people that Yad Vashem recognized as a righteous Gentile, Hasidat Umot Haolam, in the 1960s. She actually lived in Israel for several years in the 1950s. And there are many other non-Jews who participated in this rescue operation of the books. As I mentioned, the poets survive. Poets survived. They were actually belonged to the underground in the Vilna Ghetto, and they escaped literally just a week or two before the ghetto was dissolved. Liquidated was the term used. In other words, all the remaining inmates were sent to their deaths in different places, but they were able to get out, went to the forests, served as fighters, etc. Most members did not survive. My estimate is of the 40 people who worked in this brigade, only 7 or 8 survived. So that Kruk, the head of the brigade, Kalmanovich, they were both sent to labor camps in Estonia, where they were all then murdered in the fall of 43 and early 1944. Rachel Krinsky, the history teacher, was sent to a different camp, Stutthof, which is near Gdansk in Poland today, or Danzig, the German city of Danzig. This was a labor camp that eventually became a small death camp. Stutthof was an overflow camp for Auschwitz. Auschwitz was already at full capacity, and therefore they did build a crematorium in Stutthof. And Rochel Krinsky, every day in that camp was sure, just waiting her turn when she'll be killed and her body burnt in the crematorium. She was very lucky in that she survived. She survived. I can't go into all the details, the death march and things like that. She survived Stutthof, a broken woman. I found her letters to Sutskever and Kaczerginski, where she says, I see other people are falling in love, getting married after their liberation of the camp. I can't imagine that. I'll never fall in love. I don't even know what love means. I don't even know what this life means. I thought after, if I were to be liberated, I'd find some meaning in life, but I can't find any meaning in this so-called life after what I've gone through. But she has one healthy instinct, and that was she wants to reunite with her daughter. She knows her daughter is with the nanny in Vilna, and she writes in a letter to Sutskever and Kaczerginski, I can't do anything for my daughter. I mean, my daughter doesn't need me. The nanny has, from what I hear, been wonderful to her. So I can't do anything for my daughter, but maybe my daughter can help me. Maybe I can find some kind of meaning to life if I become her mother again. And she will eventually succeed in that. I'll tell you in a later point. The Soviets liberate Vilna, they now call it Vilnius, in July of 1944, right? That's the Yiddish paper, the Vorwärts, Vilna genommen. Vilna is conquered by the Red Army. And Jews, Jewish partisans and others enter the city along with the victorious Red Army. Of course, what the Jews find is a city in ruins. This is the synagogue of the Vilna Gaon in ruins. The building of YIVO, the Yiddish Institute, in ruins. Sutskever and Kaczerginski and others return to Vilna, either with or right after the Soviet army, the Red Army. They go back not to look for family and friends. They know that just about all of Vilna's Jews have been murdered. They're not going back to look for, I don't know, their apartment to get property, retrieve their private residence or even mementos. They're going back because they must finish the job. They must find the books and papers that they had hidden in the ghetto. They owe it not only to the Jewish people as a whole, but they owe it to their murdered colleagues, because they learn quickly that Kruk has been murdered, Kalmanovich has been murdered. They have to finish the job. And that means a retrieval operation. And that's the poet Sutskever, the same poet on the left, now back in Vilna in July 1944, with these hand wagons to dig with their bare hands or with very little, I can't call them shovels, but to pick away and dig up from whatever hiding places they can. And this becomes a kind of popular movement among the returning survivors. At its peak, about 50 people are directly involved in this retrieval operation. Most not from the paper brigade, but ghetto survivors who want to do a good thing. This is a picture. The man on the right is Abba Kovner, who was the commander of the FPO, of the partisan organization in the Vilna Ghetto that planned to have a Vilna Ghetto uprising. So Kovner is involved in this retrieval operation. There in the middle is Sutskever again, and this is a fragment of a Torah scroll that they've found. They don't find any full Torah scrolls. And this is Shmerka Kaczerginski with lots of artwork, rescued sculptures and mountains of Yiddish newspapers. Initially, they're collecting this material in Kaczerginski and Sutzkever's apartment. But the apartment gets filled up. There's no space for them as they're finding more and more material. And eventually, they create an institution called the Jewish Museum in Vilna, or in Vilnius. It's an officially recognized institution. You can see it there, the Soviet hammer and sickle. Right, this is the Soviet Union, but they are able to get approval, authorization to have this Jewish museum in Vilna. They get a building. The building is actually in the territory of the ghetto. The only building that they were given by the municipality was in the ghetto. It's a blown out, burnt out building without windows, with only a partial roof. And some people connected with the museum said, no, we don't want to go back to the ghetto. We want a building somewhere else. We can't take it. We don't want to work on those streets, which bring back such painful memories. But first, they had no choice. It was the only building the city gave them. And Kaczerginski, the poet, said, no, it's important. We must preserve this building for posterity, for history. This is a historical building because it's in the ghetto. And therefore, we should embrace this location. And they start repairing the building. It's a volunteer movement. They get no cooperation from Soviet authorities. They usually don't get paid any salary. It is purely a labor of love, but they come quickly to realize that this is, in a sense, an impossible task. That because they're in the Soviet Union, the deck is stacked against them, because the Soviets, especially these are the last year of Joseph Stalin's rule, which is an increasingly intensely anti-Semitic atmosphere. And they are encountering again and again state opposition and obstruction. The man who leads that obstruction and opposition is Mikhail Suslov, who at that time was the head of the Lithuanian Bureau of the Communist Party of the USSR, and closely working with Joseph Stalin. And Suslov says clearly, there should not be any Jewish institutions in this newly conquered Vilnius. There shouldn't be a Jewish museum. There shouldn't be anything else. Jews should assimilate. And he creates an impossible blockade of the museum. As a first step, the KGB visits the museum and tells the staff, you realize you can't show any of these books to anyone because they haven't passed through censorship. In the Soviet Union, you can only show books to readers if they pass through censorship. And the poets actually ask them, okay, fine, do you have any censors that can read Yiddish and Hebrew? And the KGB agents say, no. No, in a very calm voice, meaning no, we don't have such censors. We're not going to have such censors. And they meaning you'll never be able to show this material to anybody here in Vilnius. And that's when the poets realized they have rescued the material from destruction, from the Nazis, from the Germans. It is now imprisoned in the Soviet Union. That's better than destruction, but prison means it will never see the light. The Jewish people will never have see this material. And that's when they decide that they must rescue the material again. Probably the worst moment was when much of the material was outdoors. The museum didn't have enough space, so it was out in the courtyard. And one night, the sanitation department, the garbage trucks came by and collected everything that was in the courtyard and sent it away as trash. And that's when they realize, you know, Mikhail Suslov is not better or not much better than Johannes Paul, that the material is in just as much danger in the Soviet Union as it was in the ghetto. And that's when they decide they must smuggle the material out of the Soviet Union. And Sutzler and Kaczerginski both smuggle material. They were both, let me explain, Polish citizens before the war, right? Vilna had been Poland. Polish citizens were allowed after the war to repatriate, as it was called, to Poland, that is, return to the motherland, emigrate effectively to Poland. So Sutzler, Kaczerginski, many other Vilna Jews were able to leave Vilna for Poland. And they take with them suitcases with false bottoms to get them, and through other means I can't go into, they get a lot of suitcases of material out to Poland, where once they're in Poland, they will decide what to do with it. Right. So here are, again, on the left, our two poets from Vilna, now in Warsaw, Poland, and the other young Vilna writer, Chaim Grade, with Antek Zuckerman, Yitzchak Zuckerman, who's one of the leaders of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. But, and I'll mention one other thing about Poland, the Polish chapter, very important. In Poland, Rochela Krinsky returns from Stutthof to Poland and writes to her nanny and says, "You're my Polish nanny. You're also a Polish citizen. Leave Soviet Vilnius for Poland. Take my daughter with you, and let's meet up in Lodz, in the city of Lodz." And she does. The nanny comes. And this girl, Sarah Irena, is now not, 18 months old. 4 years have passed. She's now 6 years old. She doesn't recognize this woman. She just calls her ma'am very politely. She calls the nanny mommy. And it will take many months of very difficult triangle of these two mothers, if you like, or two women and the daughter. But after a certain period of time, Rochela breaks the ice, and the daughter bonds with her and is her daughter again after these 4 years of separation. Sutzker and Kaczerginski leave, and all of them will leave Poland. Poland after the war is no paradise for Jews. There's the famous pogrom in Kelts. And the material will end up in different places. I see I'm running out of time, so I'm going to make it quick. And forgive me if I skip a few slides. The Jewish Museum closes. Suslov has his way. And all the material is dumped in a former church in Vilnius, which is now the book chamber of the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic. It's thrown into the basement, and it's kept there in the basement, actually hidden in the basement, for 4 decades. From the late 1940s until the late 1980s, nobody except the director of this book chamber knew that there are thousands of Jewish books and thousands of Jewish documents in the book chamber. This only became known in the waning years of the Soviet Union, the late 1980s, under Mikhail Gorbachev and glasnost and perestroika. And it's only since the late 80s that what remained in Vilnius, what couldn't be smuggled out, has become accessible. Okay, I've talked about books and papers. To wrap it up, I just want to show you what kind of things they rescued. I've been talking as abstractions, but let's talk concretely. This is a diary by Theodor Herzl from the 1880s, before Herzl became the father of modern Zionism, which was rescued by the Paper Brigade. And most of this material was either sent to New York or ended up in Israel, as you'll see. So it was divided again in these two directions. This is the record book of the synagogue of the Vilna Gaon, that destroyed synagogue you saw. But this record book spans more than 150 years, from the 1760s till the 1920s. So while the synagogue is destroyed, the record book, the Pinkas, survived. These are little booklets that are easy to hide under your clothing, a medical manual of prayers to be said while giving birth. Many letters by Sholem Aleichem, right? The great Yiddish writer, the author of Tevye the Dairyman, later to become Fiddler on the Roof. Kaczerginski and Sutzkever had a special place in their heart for literary documents, and therefore they rescued many letters by Sholem Aleichem. This is a bust of Leon Tolstoy by the Jewish sculptor Ilya Ginsburg, which is now in Moscow, rescued also by the brigade. And then there's the contemporaneous material. This is a program from a concert by the Symphony Orchestra of the Vilna Ghetto. The Vilna Ghetto is distinguished by its cultural life, and there was a symphony orchestra, as there was theater in the Vilna Ghetto. On the left is the program of a concert. There are many documents from both the orchestra and the theater that they rescued. And this call to arms, right? The FPO, Abakovner, a call to arms, let us not go like sheep to the slaughter, calling on Jews to resist the Nazis. So this just gives you a sense of the different types of materials that they rescued through their activities. To finish, Sutzkever eventually from Poland went to Paris, and from Paris went to Israel. Actually, even before it was Israel. As you can see, he arrived in Israel in the fall of 1947 and had a long and illustrious career as a Yiddish poet and Yiddish writer in Israel. He decided that a Jewish poet should be where the Jewish people is being reborn, and made his home there. He was read by many of the leaders of Israel who knew Yiddish well, such as Golda Meir or President Zalman Shazar. Shmerke Kaczerginski survived the war, again, from Poland to Paris, and eventually settled in Buenos Aires. He was no longer a communist. He had long been disillusioned with his communism, and he headed there a Jewish cultural organization in Buenos Aires, where when accepting the job, he said, I know what dedication to Jewish culture means. I promise you the same level of dedication that I and my colleagues showed in the paper brigade in the Vilna Ghetto. Rachel Krinsky came to America. She had relatives here. She had a sister and a brother. And lo and behold, Rachel Krinsky remarried. The woman who said, I don't know what love is, I can't believe people believe in love anymore, remarried, this time to another survivor of the Vilna Ghetto, raised her daughter, Sarah, and also got to see growing up of her granddaughter. She actually they lived in New Jersey, and for the several years lived in Teaneck, New Jersey. So this is a story of heroism of a different type. This is not armed heroism, but if heroism means risking your life, I'm giving you a definition, risking your life for a noble cause that is bigger than yourself, not just thinking about how do I rescue myself or even my immediate loved ones, but I'm willing to risk my life for something important that is bigger than me, then these people are heroes no less than military heroes or heroes of armed resistance. And they found, they weren't looking to be heroes, but we can see that. And they showed that people always have choices and people can always do the right thing. And if you have courage, they had both courage, but they also, to go back to the theme of this series, found meaning in what they were doing, and therefore could look back and with pride at the way they had behaved and what they had done in the Vilna Ghetto. I'll stop here for the second round of questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Fishman. I have a few questions, but I think every word. I don't know that you can you hear me okay?
I didn't hear you well. No, try it again. I didn't hear you well.
Sorry.
Try again.
I have some. Okay, how's this?
Better.
Do you hear me? Okay, sorry. So I have a few questions, but I just wanted to know first, since we do have time left, if there was anything in the slides that you skipped that you really wanted to show us.
Well, I can. Let me just take a few questions and then I'll go back. I feel like I'd rather hear the people's questions and I'll do the slides that I skipped.
Okay. Since my there are two questions about the materials collected in Vilna, and I'm going to put them in the chat to you so that you can get them.
All right. So is that what you'd like to do? Put question? Here we are. Did the Vilna Ghetto act as a concentrating ghetto, taking in transports from other Jewish communities? If so, did the group get access to other Jewish cities? Okay, I don't know if I need to read it, but the answer is yes. There were Jews deported from other places to the Vilna Ghetto. And more directly related to the theme of my talk, this paper brigade, yes, started to process material sent in from other places. Jewish, in other words, this became a kind of central processing point for the region of Jewish materials, so that you do get shipments from other cities, as though not particularly, I don't recall Bialystok, but from Minsk and from Kovna. Let me just broaden that. This paper brigade was used not only for Jewish material, because the Germans quickly learned, wow, these Jewish intellectuals are really smart. They know all these languages, they know all this history, and they start ordering them also to process Polish and Russian cultural treasures, because again, the Nazis want to have everything, any book or any manuscript of value, so that, and they start sending in material from Russian cities like Smolensk, or from nearby Polish cities. So a lot of material passed through this paper brigade, not only Jewish material from Vilna. Okay, maybe this is go back to those other slides. Maybe I'll go back to those other slides, give you a moment. What I skipped, which I do want to fill in, is because people usually ask this, what happened to the material sent to Germany? The Germans sent a lot to Frankfurt, right? What happened to all that material sent to Germany? Let me go back to show you now those slides that I skipped. The material was sent to Frankfurt. And fortunately for, I think, everybody, Frankfurt, after the war, was in the American zone of occupied Germany. Germany, after the defeat of the Nazis, was divided up into many zones. There was the Soviet zone, there was the British zone, there was the American zone, there was even a small French zone. Fortunately, Frankfurt was in the American zone. The American military found literally, not only from Vilna, but from all of Europe, over 1 million Jewish books looted by the Nazis in different locations in Frankfurt. And they created this depot, as they called it, the Offenbach depot outside of Frankfurt. And they began processing this material, and they found the Vilna material there. About, well, 100,000 Jewish books from Vilna. And then the question was, what do they do with it? They knew it was from Vilna because of stamps, ex libris, that this is from Vilna. They organized the material by place of origin. And one option on the table was send it back to the country of origin. That was the rule with restitution in those days. Property should be sent back to the country of origin. But Vilnius was now part of the Soviet Union. And after much deliberation, the Americans decided they're not sending this stuff back to the Soviet Union. And they ended up recognizing the YIVO Institute in New York. YIVO had been reconstituted during World War II in America. That is, whoever was connected with YIVO rebuilt the institution simply in America. There was an American branch that now became the headquarters. And the American government recognized YIVO in New York as the direct continuation of YIVO in Vilna, and sent the Vilna material to New York. So that was actually a happy ending. Very paradoxical that the material that the Germans sent to Germany ended up being sent to New All in 1947. Of course, the Paper Brigade could never have anticipated that or imagined that all of that material sent to Germany would survive, and that it would actually end up being sent to New York. And it is at YIVO today in New York here. Okay, that I got in what I was, what I skipped.
Okay. How's my audio?
Okay, better. Okay.
Okay, I'm so sorry about the audio problems. A lot of people are asking about what, if you have a personal connection or personal motivation that led you to explore all this.
Well, motivations are many. I should say, though I didn't say it in this version of the talk, I was a little bit a part of this story, because when the material was discovered in that former church in the late 1980s, YIVO sent a delegation to review the material. 3 of us, the director, an archivist, and me. And so I saw that material, the Mountains of Jewish Material, in 1989, 1990. And of course, ever since I was fascinated, how did that material end up in what was once a church? And what's its story? And I wrote a short essay in 1996 about it, everything I knew about it, which was 15 pages worth, in 1996. Then I went on to my regular business, my regular work on other topics, but I never forgot this. And in the back of my mind, thought maybe it can be a book. I didn't think there was enough material for a book. So I came back to the topic, basically, well, what is it? 20 years later, more than 20 years later, no, 15 years later, and started to work on it. And so I could write a book. So that's the personal connection. And I don't have a personal family connection to Vilna. I did have teachers who came from Vilna and from Lithuania, but I don't have it's not my grandparents are not from there or anything like that. But for me, the story is in a sense a great metaphor about the perseverance of the Jewish tradition, about, of preserving what can be preserved and passing it on. And of course, they did that under extraordinary conditions, but, I really, the most personal connection is this is a metaphor, of, what we should emulate in our lives are much easier than their lives in terms of preserving and passing on.
One person asked about Paul and what was his fascination or interest with these materials? Was it purely academic or more than that?
Paul, tell you something of his biography, originally trained to be a Catholic priest, and he was a ordained Catholic priest. He went to Israel, Palestine, to study in a Catholic institute there. And he was already then very interested in the Old Testament. Then he underwent a kind of conversion. It's very interesting. He dropped the priesthood. He got married, returned to Germany shortly after Hitler came to power, and he became a devoted Nazi. And so the only continuity between his being a Catholic priest and that Catholic stage and the Nazi stage was his anti-Semitism. He had been anti-Semitic from a Catholic perspective earlier, and now he became anti-Semitic from a Nazi perspective. And so, he was both a bibliographer and a scholar, but a real devoted Nazi anti-Semite, doing it for his cause, quote unquote. And I should mention, I'm just going to throw this in because it's a rather sobering thought. Paul was arrested after the war, but he was only detained for a few months by the Americans, and then he was released. Paul was never really punished for this, what he did, not only in Vilna, but in all of Europe, as far as looting and destroying cultural treasures. He was very lucky. He kept a low profile, and he and his staff were really never punished for what they did.
So for our last question, there are a couple questions about YIVO. Has the material been digitized? And also someone asked if you're willing to talk about some of the alleged added stamping that occurred so as to send materials to YIVO.
I think the added stamping is for a private conversation, not for this forum. That would take a lot of explaining. But there is a big digitization project now, because you understand that this material is scattered. Some of it's in New York, some of it's in Vilnius, Lithuania, and some of it's in Jerusalem and in other parts of Israel. And you can even have the same manuscript where one page is in New York, one page is in Vilnius, and one page is in Israel, because things got split up and scattered. So there is a big digitization project and much of it is online on the YIVO website today, to reunite the collections. This material is important in at least two different ways. One, it's important because it documents Jewish life in Eastern Europe before the Holocaust, this lost world, this is what we have left from that lost world. In most cases, we don't even have the buildings, right? So many buildings were Jewish. We don't even have the architecture of Jewish buildings. So we don't, the Jews are murdered. Their buildings are destroyed. All we've got from that world is the books and documents. So in that sense, it's precious. But because this material is also survived thanks to Jewish heroism, that adds another layer. In other words, this is like holy material. This is testimony to Jewish heroism and Jewish martyrdom. So even irrespective of their contents, which are very important, the very way in which they have reached us, make it very important that they be preserved and cherished.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fishman. I wanted to make sure everyone knows about, I'm posting in the chat, we have a wonderful podcast series that Dr. Fishman did an episode of, where I think you speak even more about the meaning of this whole endeavor so poignantly. So I just shared the link with people. And of course, if you're looking for Dr. Fishman's book, The Book Smugglers, it's everywhere you can buy books: Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Audible, Google Play Books. You can get it anywhere, and we hope you will. And I just wanted to thank you for for everything that you put personally into reconstructing what happened here, so that we could all know about it. And thank you for sharing it with us today. It's a really it's a very beautiful way to end this series on living a life of meaning, and seeing how far people will go to do so, to make their lives meaningful. So thank you very much. Thank you to everyone for joining us for this series, and we will be in touch about the next series, and we look forward to seeing you again in January. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you.